The wind screamed like a dying animal, tearing at the walls of the old barn. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets that turned the world to a churning gray blur. Boone Carter, his back braced against the groaning barn door, fought to slide the heavy crossbar into place. The wood was slick, swollen with water, and his knuckles were raw where he'd scraped them against the splintered planks. His ranch nestled in a valley that was usually a placid cradle of grass, and River Willow was now at the mercy of a storm that sought to scour it from the earth. He'd lost 2 fence lines already, and the river his lifeblood had transformed into a mud-brown monster, clawing at its banks and swallowing whole sections of his pasture. Now it was coming for the barn. He gave one final desperate shove. The bars scraped, groaned, and finally slammed home. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing against the gale's fury. That was when he saw them. 2 riders materializing from the deluge like phantoms. They weren't fighting the storm. They seemed part of it, their oilskin slickers plastered to their frames, their horses moving with a grim, deliberate purpose. They stopped 20 yards from him, twin silhouettes against the maelstrom and their faces obscured by the brims of their sodden hats. They weren't neighbors seeking shelter. Neighbors didn't move like that. Carter, one of them, yelled, his voice a gravelly tear in the fabric of the storm. "You've had your warnings." Boone's hand instinctively went to the worn handle of the axe leaning against the barn wall. His rifle was in the cabin, a lifetime away. "I don't know you," he shouted back, the wind snatching the words from his mouth. "You don't need to." The second man called, his tone smoother, more dangerous. "You just need to know who we work for. Mr. Gann is a patient man, but his patience has run out. This valley is slated for development. Your Scratch Patch Farm is in the way. Marcus Gann." The name was familiar. A slick developer from Millfield buying up land for the railroad, they said. He'd received offers letters filled with legal jargon that he'd used to light his hearth. This land was all he had left of Ruth. He wasn't selling. "This is my land, Boone," roared his voice, cracking with a mix of fury and futility. The first rider laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's mud and rock, old man. And right now it's about to be river bottom. Take the offer, or don't. Either way, you'll be gone by spring." Suddenly, a sound deeper than the storm's roar shook the ground. A low, grinding tremor that vibrated up through the soles of Boone's boots. It was the sound of the world coming apart. The river, gorged beyond its limits, had breached the northern bend. A wall of churning water carrying with it uprooted trees, and the debris of the valley was surging towards them. The riders' horses whinnied in panic, their training overcome by primal terror. The men cursed, wrestling with the reins, their threats forgotten in the face of annihilation. For a heartbeat, all 3 of them were frozen, watching the roiling wave of destruction bear down on the ranch. And in that heartbeat, Boone saw them. 2 small figures clinging desperately to a half-submerged log, spinning in the maelstrom. Children. Their faces were pale blurs of terror, their dark hair plastered to their skulls. They were being swept directly into the path of the flood's main surge towards a tangle of shattered trees that would act as a sieve, trapping and crushing anything caught within it. The 2 riders saw them too. The first man stared, his face slack with shock. The second merely grunted, turned his horse, and spurred it toward higher ground, shouting, "Not our problem. Let's go." Their threats, their employer, all of it vanished from Boone's mind. There was only the water, the screaming wind, and the 2 small lives about to be extinguished. He had to make a choice, an instantaneous calculation of survival. Save himself, get to the cabin, or dive into the treacherous, debris-filled current. It wasn't a choice at all. Not for a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He dropped the axe and sprinted towards the water's edge, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. The cold shock of the river was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. The current was a living thing, a muscular beast that grabbed him, trying to drag him under to pull him into the same deadly embrace that held the children. He fought it, kicking with a strength born of pure desperation. He was a strong swimmer raised on this very river, but he had never felt a power like this. A jagged branch scraped his side, tearing his shirt. He ignored the pain. "Here," he yelled, though he knew they couldn't hear him over the roar. "Reach for me." The log they were on bucked and twisted. The smaller child, a boy, lost his grip and slipped under the surface. Boone lunged his fingers, closing around the thin fabric of the boy's shirt, and hauled him back up, coughing and sputtering. The boy was light, no older than 6, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was silent. The girl was older, maybe 8. She was holding onto the log with one hand and clutching something to her chest with the other. As Boone reached for her, a surge of water slammed the log against his shoulder, and a flash of silver caught his eye. Something had fallen from her grasp, dangling from a delicate chain, a small silver locket, oval-shaped with a single tiny rose etched into its surface. The world stopped. The roar of the water faded to a distant hum. The freezing cold vanished. There was only that locket twisting in the current, a ghost from a life he thought was buried forever. It was Ruth's. Her mother had given it to her. He had placed it around her neck on their wedding day. He had held it in his hand as she drew her last shallow breath. He snatched it from the water, his fingers closing around the cold metal as if it were his wife's hand. Then he grabbed the girl, his movements now frantic, primal. He hooked his arm around her, holding both children tight against him, and kicked for the shore with every ounce of strength he had left. The current fought him, pulled at him. But the weight of the locket in his fist was an anchor to the world, a promise he had to keep. He collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air, the children limp and shivering beside him. He had pulled them from the river. But as he stared at the locket in his palm, its familiar etching a cruel brand on his soul, he understood that he was the one who had just been dragged into a current far deeper and more dangerous than any flood water. How did this child have his wife's locket? The question was a hook, and it had just buried itself in his heart. The fire in the hearth crackled a defiant sound against the storm that still raged outside the small cabin. Boone had wrapped the children in his thickest wool blankets and set them on the worn rug before the flames. The boy Dakota had succumbed to an exhausted sleep almost immediately, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The girl Ayanna sat awake, her dark eyes tracking Boone's every move. She had not spoken a word, but her gaze was heavy with an intelligence that seemed beyond her years. The silver locket lay on the rough-hewn mantel, a gleaming accusation in the firelight. Boone had tried to ask her about it. He'd held it out, his hand trembling. Where did you get this?" Ayanna had simply looked at it, then at him, and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her silence was more unnerving than any answer she could have given. Now, as he ladled warm broth into a bowl, his mind replayed the scene in the flood 100 times. The locket hadn't been around her neck. She had been clutching it, protecting it, as if it were a mission. But that made no sense. He had buried Ruth with that locket. He had held her cold hand, slipped it from her neck, and placed it in her palm before he covered her grave with the dark, unforgiving soil of Devil's Bend. No one knew it was there. No one. He carried the bowl to the girl. "You need to eat," he said, his voice gruff, softened by a grief that was suddenly as raw as it had been 3 years ago. She accepted the bowl, her small hands steady. She sipped the broth slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. It was an unnerving, calculating stare, as if she were measuring his worth, his intent. Children weren't supposed to look at you like they knew your future. The cabin, his sanctuary of solitude, was now filled with ghosts. The air carried the lingering scent of rosemary from the bush Ruth had planted by the door. The empty chair by the hearth seemed to hold her shape in the flickering light. He had lived with these ghosts for years, a quiet, orderly haunting. But the locket and the children who brought it had stirred them into a frenzy. He sank into his own chair, and the exhaustion of the rescue settling deep into his bones. His gaze fell upon an old locked footlocker in the corner, a relic of a past life he tried to keep buried. Inside were his army uniform, his discharge papers, and the memories of a war he'd fought for a cause he no longer understood. A time before Ruth. A time of following orders of smoke and blood, and the chilling realization that good men could do terrible things. He hadn't opened that trunk in years. Tonight he felt its lock straining. A nightmare took him in his chair. Not of the flood, but of an older, drier terror. The sun beating down on cracked earth that split like old leather. The smell of sage and gunpowder. The sounds of a bugle and screams that didn't belong in the daylight. He was younger in a blue uniform, his rifle hot in his hands. A scout with a long, pale scar down his left cheek was pointing his words confident, assuring the captain that the encampment ahead was hostile. They raided the supply lines at Willow Creek, sir. I tracked them here myself. Boone remembered the doubt, a cold knot in his stomach, but he was a soldier. He followed orders. He awoke with a jolt, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cabin's chill. The fire had burned down to embers. The storm had finally broken. Through the window, the first fragile rays of dawn painted the ravaged landscape in shades of gray and rose. The children were awake. They weren't by the fire. They were near the door, scratching in the thin layer of mud and dust on the floorboards. Over and over, with a frantic shared urgency, they drew the same symbol, 3 wavy lines, intersected by a single straight mark. It was a message, a map, a warning. But for whom? That's when he heard it. A sound that cut through the morning stillness and made his blood run cold. The rhythmic, percussive thunder of horses. Many horses. An army. Ayanna and Dakota stopped drawing. They looked at each other, not with fear, but with a solemn recognition. They stood up and walked to the window, peering toward the horizon. They had been waiting. Boone grabbed his Winchester from its pegs above the door. The familiar weight was a small comfort. He checked the chamber, his hands shaking slightly. 3 rounds. 3 bullets against the army that was now cresting the ridge. Warriors, 100 of them, moved in perfect silent formation. The rising sun glinted off the tips of their lances and the barrels of their rifles. At their head rode a man whose bearing was one of absolute authority. Tall, straight-backed, his presence commanded the entire valley. Boone's mind raced. He'd kept the peace, traded fairly, respected the boundaries. Why now? The answer stood beside him, 2 small children who looked upon the approaching force not as a threat, but as a long-awaited arrival. Ayanna turned from the window. She stepped towards him and placed her small hand on his arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a startling maturity, then pointed to the symbol they had drawn in the dirt. The river. His land. A meeting place. He finally understood. He hadn't just saved them from the river. He had been chosen. He was a piece in a puzzle he couldn't comprehend, and the man leading 100 warriors was coming to collect. Boone Carter stepped onto his porch rifle, held low but visible. He would not cower inside like a guilty man. The children flanked him, the girl to his right, the boy to his left. Their presence was both a shield and a verdict. The lead warrior raised a hand, and the thunder of 100 horses ceased as one. The silence that fell was more profound, more terrifying than the charge had been. The man dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. He was younger than Boone expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with the lean, powerful build of a seasoned leader. His eyes, dark and sharp, swept over the cabin, the ruined corral, the small garden plot, taking in every detail of Boone's life before finally settling on him. Boone felt the weight of that gaze, a silent judgment that stripped him bare. But then the man's eyes found the children. The hard mask of command cracked. An expression of such profound, overwhelming relief flooded his features that for a moment he was not a chief, but simply a father. Papa Ayana's cry was a clear, sharp note that broke the tension. She ran from the porch, her bare feet splashing through the mud. The chief dropped to one knee and gathered both his children into a fierce embrace, burying his face in their wet hair. He murmured to them in their native tongue soft, desperate words of love and relief that needed no translation. The warriors behind him relaxed their grips on their weapons, loosening. The immediate threat of violence had passed, but the air remained thick with unanswered questions. The reunion was brief. The chief stood, his composure restored, though his hands never left his children's shoulders. His stern expression returned as he studied Boone. "I am Kestrel of the Northern Wind," he said, his English formal and precise, each word carefully chosen. "These are my children." "Boone Carter," Boone replied, his voice hoarse. "I pulled them from the river during the storm." Kestrel's eyes narrowed slightly. "My children do not go near the river alone when it runs high. They know the danger." The implication hung between them as tangible as the morning mist. If they did not go willingly, they must have been taken. And the man whose land bordered that treacherous stretch of water was the most likely suspect. Before Boone could defend himself, Ayana began speaking rapidly to her father, her small hands gesturing wildly towards Boone, the churning river, the sky. She was recounting the rescue, the story of her survival pouring out of her. Kestrel listened with an unnerving stillness, his expression unreadable. His entire world, it seemed, hung on the testimony of his 8-year-old daughter. When she finished, he knelt before her. "The pouch, Ayana. Show me." The girl nodded, fumbling with a small, water-stained leather pouch that was tied around her neck. She had kept it hidden beneath her blanket. She opened it and tipped its contents into her father's outstretched palm. It wasn't a piece of carved bone. It was the locket. Kestrel's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the small silver oval, his face paling beneath his sun-darkened skin. He turned it over his thumb, tracing the etched rows. Whatever he saw there, whatever memory it invoked, it shook him to his core. The air grew tense again. The warriors shifted, sensing their leader's sudden distress. Slowly, Kestrel rose to his feet. He looked at Boone, and his eyes held a new, far more complex emotion. It was not gratitude. It was a chilling mix of suspicion, disbelief, and something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. "Where did you find my children?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Downstream, caught in the rocks near Devil's Bend." Kestrel's jaw tightened. Devil's Bend is consecrated earth, a resting place for our ancestors. No one goes there. He held up the locket. "And this should not exist. It was buried with the woman who saved my people." Boone's stomach twisted into a knot of ice. What woman, he managed to ask, though he already knew the answer. He knew it with a certainty that defied logic, a cold dread that settled over him like a burial shroud. Years ago, Kestrel began, his voice low, resonating with old pain. A blue-coat army led astray by a lying scout attacked a winter camp of ours. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. Many of our elders, women, and children were lost. He paused, his gaze distant. After the soldiers left, a nurse appeared, a white woman from the army fort. She came alone against her commander's orders. She tended to our wounded, fought the fever that followed the slaughter, and worked until her own body gave out. He looked directly at Boone, his eyes boring into him. Her name was Ruth. And when she died, we buried her with honor at Devil's Bend, among our own fallen chiefs. My father placed this locket in her hands himself, as a symbol of the life she gave for us. The world tilted on its axis. "Ruth, here." He thought she had died of a camp fever at the fort miles away. The official letter had been so brief, so sterile. He had never known. He had never known she had died a hero in the arms of the very people his own unit had been sent to fight. Someone sent my children there. Kestrel continued, his voice hardening into granite. Someone who knew that grave. Someone who knew what was in it. They sent them to dig up the one object that would connect you, her husband, to the desecration of our most sacred ground. They wanted me to find this locket in your house. His hand closed around the silver oval, his knuckles white. Because our law is clear. Disturb the resting place of an honored spirit, and your life is forfeit. They wanted me to ride here with 100 warriors and kill you. The elaborate cruelty of the plan settled over Boone. Someone had orchestrated this entire tragedy using his and Kestrel's shared grief as a weapon. Who? Boone whispered the name, a ghost on his tongue. Who would know all of this? Dakota, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He looked up at his father, then at Boone, and spoke in halting English. Man had scar. Here. He traced a long, thin line down his left cheek. Scarman told us. Said, White Spirit Woman was lonely. Said her husband needed her necklace back. To make her spirit peaceful. The breath left Kestrel's body in a hiss. Every warrior within earshot tensed, their hands flying to their weapons. The name was unspoken, but they all knew. Boone knew. The scout from his nightmare. The man whose false intelligence had led to the massacre. The man who had set in motion the chain of events that killed his wife. Marcus Gan Boone said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Kestrel's nod was sharp confirmation of a shared enemy. He was the army's translator. The scout. He orchestrated the attack to clear the valley for the first land surveys. After the army discharged him, he used his knowledge to work for the territorial developers. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Gan knew about the massacre. He knew Boone was a soldier in that unit. He knew Ruth was the camp nurse. And somehow he had learned of her burial and the locket. Devil's Bend was not just sacred to Kestrel's people. It was the place where evidence of Gan's first and greatest crime was buried along with Ruth. He couldn't risk anyone, settler or native, ever digging there. So he devised a plan to seal it forever. He wanted you to kill me. Boone said, his voice flat with disbelief. To create so much bloodshed over this land that the territorial government would have no choice but to seal it off permanently. No surveys, no settlers, no one to ever uncover what he did. And he used my own children, Kestrel snarled, his rage a palpable force, and the memory of your wife to do it. A warrior posted as a lookout on the ridge let out a sharp cry. He pointed east toward the road to Millfield, a lone rider pushing his horse hard. Even from a distance, they could see the man's desperate urgency. He's running, one of Kestrel's warriors said. He will not get far, Kestrel promised. He turned and issued a series of crisp commands in his own language. 20 warriors wheeled their horses, their movements a fluid dance of vengeance, and galloped out to intercept the fleeing man. Boone looked from the departing warriors to the locket still in Kestrel's hand. This was no longer just about land rights or a stolen artifact. It was about a massacre, a murdered wife, and a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Millfield, Boone said, his voice hard. That's where he keeps his records. The survey maps the land deeds. The proof of his fraud has to be there. Kestrel met his gaze, and in that moment, an unspoken alliance was forged between the grieving chief and the haunted widower. Then we ride for Millfield. The journey to Millfield was a grim 2-day passage through a landscape that mirrored the turmoil in Boone's soul. The sun baked the cracked earth, and the wind carried nothing but dust and the scent of sage. He and Kestrel rode side by side, a silent pact holding them together. Kestrel had left the children in the care of his most trusted warriors, with instructions to return them to the village. His focus was now singular, a burning coal of righteous fury. Boone's mind, however, was a storm of fragmented memories. The ride unlocked pieces of his past he had long kept buried. The face of the scout gone floated in his memory, the smug confidence, the easy lies, the pale scar that seemed to deepen when he smiled. He remembered the unease among the soldiers, the whispers that Gon's intelligence was often too convenient, leading them to hostile camps on land that was coincidentally perfect for settlement. "He spoke your language," Boone said, breaking a long silence as they crested a dusty mesa. "He was your translator during the treaty negotiations, wasn't he?" Kestrel's profile was as sharp as a hawk's. "He was. We discovered too late that he was changing our words. Treaties we believed protected our ancestral lands actually signed them away. But my father was a scholar. He kept his own records of every meeting in our own script, records that would prove Gan's deception. And those records, they were buried with him." Kestrel set his voice tight. "As is our custom, Gan knew this. The desecration of my father's grave. It was not just a trick to use my children. It was a search. He was looking for those records. The depth of Gan's villainy was staggering. He had not one but two secrets buried at Devil's Bend, proof of a massacre and proof of systematic fraud. Ruth's grave was merely the key he chose to lock it all away forever. They arrived in Millfield as dusk was bleeding across the sky, turning the clapboard buildings into stark silhouettes. It was a town built on ambition, smelling of fresh-cut lumber horse manure and greed. The Territorial Land and Survey Office was the grandest building on the main street, a two-story brick structure that announced the government's authority. As they dismounted, an old man with a sweeping white mustache and a tarnished silver star on his vest stepped out of the sheriff's office next door. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and missed nothing. "Kestrel," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Don't often see you this far into town. And you," he added, his gaze falling on Boone, "look like you've ridden straight through hell." Sheriff Thompson Kestrel greeted him with a nod of respect. "We're here on urgent business concerning Marcus Gon." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Gan. That figures. He's got half the town council in his pocket and the other half scared of him. What's he done now?" "He used my children to desecrate a grave," Kestrel said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I believe he's responsible for the death of my wife." Boone added the words, feeling solid real for the first time. Sheriff Thompson stroked his mustache, his gaze moving between the two men, one a native chief, the other a poor rancher united by a common enemy. "Gan's a viper. Smooth on the outside, poison on the inside. But he's clever. To go after him, you'll need more than accusations. You'll need proof." "It's in there," Boone said, nodding towards the land office. "Forged maps, fraudulent deeds. It has to be." "Office is locked up for the night," the sheriff said. "But the clerk is a nervous fella. Owes money all over town. For a few dollars, his memory might improve about where Gan keeps his private files." While the sheriff went to persuade the clerk, Boone and Kestrel waited in the growing darkness. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant tinkling of a saloon piano. "She spoke of you," Kestrel said suddenly. Boone turned to him. "Ruth?" "Yes. In her final days when the fever was high. She spoke of her husband, a soldier. A good man, she said, who was lost in a bad war. She worried you would carry the weight of it forever." He paused, looking at Boone with an unsettling clarity. "She said you had the kindest eyes she'd ever seen." A lump formed in Boone's throat. For 3 years he had mourned her death in a vacuum of official reports and lonely memories. To hear her words spoken by this man, whose people she had died saving, was to have a piece of her returned to him. It was both a comfort and an agony. The sheriff returned a set of keys jangling in his hand. "Clerk says Gon has a private office in the basement. Keeps his most sensitive records there. He's not due back in town until tomorrow afternoon. This is our only chance to look before he knows we're coming." The basement of the land office was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging paper. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows across shelves overflowing with rolled maps and leather-bound ledgers. A large oak desk dominated the center of the room, a smaller locked metal strongbox beside it. "This is it," the sheriff whispered, running a hand over the strongbox. The clerk said, "Gon's the only one with a key." Boone's eyes scanned the room. His gaze fell upon a row of thick, dusty army ledgers on a high shelf, forgotten records from the old fort. Acting on a hunch, he pulled one down. It was a regimental log from the year of the massacre. He flipped through the brittle pages, his heart pounding. And there it was. Scouting Report, March 12th. Filed by M. Gann. Confirmed hostile activity at encampment near Devil's Bend. Engagement authorized. It was the lie immortalized in official ink. Just then they heard footsteps on the floorboards above. Heavy, confident steps. "He's back," the sheriff hissed, drawing his pistol. A day early. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, spilling a rectangle of lamplight into the darkness. A figure started down the steps. It wasn't Gann. It was one of the thugs from the barn, the one with the gravelly voice. He stopped halfway down, peering into the gloom. "Boss," he called out, "you down here?" Before anyone could move, a second figure appeared behind him. Marcus Gann. He was dressed in a fine town suit, his face composed and serene. The scar on his cheek was a faint silver line in the lantern light. He saw them, the sheriff Kestrel Boone, holding the open army ledger. He didn't look surprised. He looked amused. "Well, well," Gann said, his voice as smooth as polished riverstone. "A clandestine gathering. Sheriff, I hope you have a warrant. And Kestrel, you are trespassing on territorial property." His eyes finally landed on Boone, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "And Boone Carter, we meet again. Though I suppose you wouldn't remember our first encounter. You were just a boy in a uniform following orders." The casual, chilling confirmation stole the air from Boone's lungs. It was him. It was all true. "This is over, Gann," the sheriff said, his pistol steady. "We have enough to arrest you for fraud, incitement, and desecration." Gann chuckled, a low, condescending sound. "Do you? All you have is the word of a senile lawman, a grieving savage, and a failed farmer haunted by a war he barely survived. I, on the other hand, have friends. Influential friends." He took a step down, revealing the man standing behind him, Commissioner Walsh, the head of the Territorial Authority, his face a mask of stern disapproval. Sheriff Thompson Walsh said, his voice booming with authority. "Mr. Gann informed me you might be conspiring with these agitators to undermine territorial law. Put away your weapon. You are interfering with an official investigation." Gann's trap had been sprung. He hadn't come back early by accident. He had brought the highest authority in the territory to find them red-handed breaking into his office. He had twisted the narrative, painting them as the criminals. The viper had struck, and they had walked right into his fangs. The wind began to howl outside, a low moan that rattled the window panes. A sandstorm was coming. Commissioner Walsh's presence changed the very air in the room, charging it with a cold, bureaucratic power that rendered the sheriff's pistol useless. Walsh was the law here, and he was standing with Gann. "Commissioner," Sheriff Thompson said, lowering his weapon, but not his gaze. "Gann has committed serious crimes. We have evidence. Evidence you obtained by breaking into a federal office." Gann interjected smoothly, stepping down into the basement. He gestured at the open army ledger in Boone's hands. "Stealing government property, no less. Commissioner, these men are desperate. Kestrel is trying to halt lawful land assessments, and Carter holds a personal grudge against me from our time in the service." Walsh looked at Boone, his eyes filled with stern judgment. "Is this true, Mr. Carter? Is this personal?" Boone's mind reeled. How could he explain the massacre, Ruth's death, the locket, a story so complex and monstrous it sounded like a madman's raving when Gon stood there looking so composed, so reasonable? He's lying. Boone said, his voice rough. He falsified that report. He led us into a massacre. Gon sighed, a performance of weary patience. A difficult campaign, Commissioner. Hard choices were made. Mr. Carter was young, idealistic. He never understood the necessities of securing this territory. His guilt has clearly festered into a dangerous delusion. The wind shrieked and sand began to hiss against the thick basement windows. The storm was closing in, trapping them. This delusion, as you call it, involves my children. Kestrel said, his voice a blade of ice. Whom you manipulated into robbing a grave. An unfortunate misunderstanding, Gan countered, turning to Walsh. I was attempting to recover and preserve native artifacts that were being washed away by the recent flood. The children were helping me. Chief Kestrel has misinterpreted my intentions. Every truth they presented, Gan twisted into a plausible lie, using their grief and anger against them, making them look like the unreasonable ones. He was a master puppeteer, and he had maneuvered them into a corner. I have seen enough, Walsh declared. Sheriff, I am placing you on administrative leave pending an inquiry. Kestrel, you will return to your lands and cease this interference. Mr. Carter, you will be detained for questioning. It was over. Gon had won. But as Gon's men, the same thugs from the ranch, moved to grab Boone, Ayana's small, determined face flashed in his mind. He remembered her trusting hand on his arm. He remembered Kestrel's quiet dignity in the face of impossible grief. He remembered Ruth's locket. He would not let it end like this. The strongbox, Boone said, his voice ringing with sudden clarity. If you're so innocent, Gon, open it. Show the Commissioner your sensitive research. Gan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My private papers are not relevant to this matter. I think they are, Sheriff Thompson pressed, seeing the opening. Commissioner, if Mr. Gan has nothing to hide, let him prove it. Walsh hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. The request was reasonable. Marcus opened the box. Gan's eyes darted around the room, calculating. He was trapped. He knew it. The smooth mask of civility began to crack, revealing the venomous contempt beneath. This is an outrage. I will not be subjected to this witch hunt. He lunged, not at Boone or Kestrel, but at the lantern sitting on the desk. With a sweep of his arm, he sent it crashing to the floor. Oily flames erupted, licking at the scattered papers and dry floorboards. The room was plunged into a terrifying chaos of smoke and shadow. Fire, the sheriff yelled. Gan used the confusion to his advantage. He shoved past Walsh, grabbed a heavy ledger from a shelf, and hurled it at the basement's single-barred window. The glass shattered. The wind howled into the room, fanning the flames and filling the air with a blinding swirl of sand and smoke. Through the maelstrom, Boone saw Gon scrambling toward the broken window, trying to escape. But Kestrel was faster. He moved like a shadow, tackling Gon and sending them both crashing to the floor amidst the spreading fire. The two thugs drew their weapons, but Walsh, his face a grim mask of fury at Gon's blatant guilt, bellowed, "Stand down. I am the law here." The fire was growing, consuming the dry paper, turning Gan's web of lies into ash. The smoke was thick, choking. Boone grabbed a heavy wool blanket from a crate and began beating at the flames, trying to keep them from reaching the shelves of official records. Suddenly, a section of the burning ceiling groaned and collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and flaming debris down, separating them from the exit. They were trapped in the burning, sand-filled basement with a desperate man. The sandstorm had turned the world outside into a howling, monochromatic void. Inside the basement, the fire raged, casting demonic shadows on the smoke-choked walls. Gon, wrestling free from Kestrel's grip, staggered to his feet, his face wild, his fine suit smudged with soot. The charming politician was gone, replaced by a cornered rat. He saw his escape route blocked by a wall of flame and his path to the stairs blocked by Boone and the sheriff. His eyes, frantic and gleaming with a mad light, searched for a weapon, a shield and advantage. They landed on Commissioner Walsh, who was coughing, disoriented by the smoke. With a desperate snarl, Gon grabbed the older man, pulling him back and pressing the barrel of a small derringer previously hidden in his coat to the commissioner's temple. "Nobody move," Gon screamed, his voice raw. "Or the territory gets a new commissioner." Walsh froze, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Marcus, you wouldn't. I've done far worse to get what I want." Gon spat, his gaze locking onto Boone. This was it. The final unmasking. All pretense was gone. "You, Carter? You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? You had to come back from the dead. This isn't about the army anymore." Gon Boone said, his hands clenched, his body tensed to spring. "Isn't it?" Gon laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "It's always been about the army. It's about that massacre you were too weak to stomach. That land was supposed to be mine, my first big score, but your precious self-righteous wife." His face twisted with a deep, festering resentment. She saw too much, heard too much. A terrible cold dread washed over Boone. He felt Kestrel tense beside him. "What are you talking about?" "Your Ruth," Gan sneered, pressing the gun harder against Walsh's head. "She wasn't just a nurse. She was a meddler. She figured it out. She knew I falsified the intel. She found one of the survivors, an old woman who spoke some English. She put it all together. She was going to write a report, expose me." The smoke burned Boone's lungs, but it was Gon's words that suffocated him. He saw Ruth not as a victim of a random fever, but as an investigator, a warrior in her own right, fighting for the truth. The fever that swept the camp after the attack. Boone's voice was a choked whisper. "You said she died of the fever." Gan's smile was the most evil thing Boone had ever witnessed. "Oh, she caught the fever all right, along with a dozen others. But a supply wagon with fresh quinine and medicine was due to arrive from the fort. Funny thing, though, that wagon, it got lost. Ambushed by hostiles, according to the report. The medicine was destroyed." He paused, letting the horror sink in. "I made sure of it. I watched your wife die, Carter. Watched her burn up, begging for medicine that I had dumped in a ravine 5 miles away. I killed her to protect my future. And you are the one loose end I could never tie up." The world dissolved into a singular point of white-hot rage. It wasn't just a massacre. It wasn't just a desecrated grave. It was murder. Cold, calculated, and intensely personal. This man had not only caused the death of his wife, he had actively, cruelly engineered it. The sound that escaped Boone's throat was not human. It was a roar of pure primal grief and fury. He lunged, ignoring the sheriff's shout, ignoring the gun. He saw nothing but Gon's face, the scar, a river of hate he wanted to erase from the world. He had a clear shot. Through the smoke, he saw an opening. The sheriff's fallen pistol was only a few feet away. He could grab it in this and send Marcus Gan to the hell he so richly deserved. Vengeance was a living fire in his veins. But as his hand reached for the gun, another hand clamped down on his arm, strong and steady. It was Kestrel. "No, Boone," Kestrel said, his voice cutting through the rage. "We seek justice, not vengeance. Do not become the man he is." Kestrel's words were a bucket of cold water on the fire in his soul. He looked from Gon's sneering face to Kestrel's solemn one. He saw Ayanna and Dakota. He saw Ruth not as a victim to be avenged, but as the woman who had died trying to bring truth to light. Justice. That's what she would have wanted. The decision was made in a heartbeat. Instead of grabbing the pistol, Boone dove low, tackling Gan at the knees. The derringer went off with a deafening crack, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. The move threw Gan off balance, forcing him to release the commissioner. Walsh stumbled away, gasping. Kestrel was on Gan in an instant, disarming him with brutal efficiency. The fight was short and savage. Boone and Kestrel, united in purpose, subdued the flailing cursing man, pinning him to the floor as the fire raged around them, and the sandstorm howled its fury. Just as they tied Gan's hands with a strip of leather from a fallen saddlebag, the basement door crashed open at the top of the stairs. Sheriff Thompson's deputies, alerted by the gunshot, poured in their faces, grim under the brims of their hats. They stood in a tableau of hellish light, the burning records of a corrupt man's life, the howling wind, and the two men, one white, one native, who had brought him down not with vengeance, but with a justice as relentless as the storm itself. The sandstorm abated with the dawn, leaving the world scoured clean and unnaturally quiet. Millfield was coated in a fine layer of red dust, as if the earth itself had bled during the night. The fire in the land office had been contained, but the basement was a blackened, waterlogged tomb of secrets. In the stark morning light, a securely bound Marcus Gan was led from the sheriff's office by two grim-faced deputies. His fine suit was ruined, his face a mask of soot and defeated fury. He would be taken by armored coach to the territorial prison to await a trial whose outcome was now a certainty. Commissioner Walsh, his face haggard but his resolve clear, had provided a full damning statement corroborating every detail of Gan's confession. After Gan was gone, Walsh summoned Boone and Kestrel to the sheriff's office. The room was quiet, the air thick with the weight of the night's events. Maps were spread across the sheriff's desk, Gan's own meticulously forged survey maps. What Gan did, Walsh began, his voice heavy, was a betrayal of everything this territory is supposed to stand for. The treaties he corrupted will be declared null and void. But untangling his legal deceptions could take years in the courts. Years your people don't have. He looked at Kestrel, his expression one of sincere regret. Boone stepped forward, pointing to the maps. We don't need years. We can use his own lies against him. He traced a line on the survey with his finger. This is my property line, according to his fraudulent survey. It illegally incorporates the river and the lands leading to Devil's Bend. But on this older legitimate map, the boundary is here. He pointed to another line a mile to the south. If you restore the original boundaries legally and permanently, based on the pre-Gan treaties, the ancestral lands are returned. No court battles. Just a correction of a criminal's fraud. Walsh looked from Boone to Kestrel, a slow understanding dawning on his face. It was a simple, elegant solution, using the tools of a corrupt system to create a just outcome. It can be done. Walsh said, a note of relief in his voice. I will sign the order myself. Kestrel studied Boone, a look of profound respect in his eyes. You would give up your claim to the river, to the most fertile part of your land. It was never my claim to begin with, Boone said simply. It belongs to the spirits you honor at Devil's Bend. It belongs to the memory of my wife. 2 weeks later, Boone Carter stood before the tribal council. He was not in the great lodge, but in the open air, under the shade of an ancient cottonwood where the elders in Kestrel sat in a solemn circle. He had been invited not as a prisoner or a petitioner, but as a witness. He told his story from the moment he saw the children in the river to the confession in the burning basement. He spoke of Ruth not as his wife, but as the woman who had tried to save them. When he finished, a long silence fell over the council. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, finally spoke. You are the husband of the spirit nurse, she said, her voice soft but clear. She was a bridge between our worlds, a bridge Gan tried to burn. You have helped to rebuild it. Kestrel then addressed the elders. Boone Carter has no home now. He has given his land back to the earth. He is a man of honor who understands both the white man's laws and the spirit of our own. He could be a valuable ally, a voice for us in the world that is pressing in. The council deliberated. Boone waited, feeling more judged by their quiet consideration than he had under the barrels of 100 rifles. Finally, Kestrel stood. "The council has decided. You have lost a home, but you have not been left homeless. We offer you a place among us, not as a guest, but as a member of our tribe, a bridge builder. Will you accept?" Boone looked at the faces around him, wary but open. He saw Ayanna and Dakota watching him from a distance, their expressions hopeful. He had spent 3 years living with ghosts in a lonely cabin. Here he was being offered a life among the living. "I accept," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Months passed. The valley healed. New grass grew over the scars left by the flood. The river ran clear and calm. Devil's Bend and the consecrated earth was at peace. A newly carved boundary marker signed by both Kestrel and Commissioner Walsh stood as a permanent testament to the restored lands. One evening, as the autumn sun set, casting long shadows that looked like bridges across the valley, Boone walked to the riverbank at Devil's Bend. The tribe had flourished. With their water rights and ancestral land secure, they had negotiated fair trade agreements with the settlers in Millfield, with Boone acting as their translator and advocate. He had found a purpose he never knew he was looking for. Ayanna ran to meet him, her steps light on the soft earth. She pressed something small and cool into his hand. It was the silver locket. "Grandmother says it belongs with you now," she said quietly. She said Ruth's spirit is at peace because you brought the truth to light. Her work is finished. Boone closed his fingers around it. He walked to a young sapling the tribe had planted near the river, a symbol of new life and new beginnings. He knelt in the soft soil and carefully placed Ruth's locket at the base of the small tree, letting it rest against the bark. It was not a burial. It was a planting. He was laying his grief to rest, not to forget, but to let it become part of this new life, a root for the family he had found. Kestrel came and stood beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. They watched as Dakota joined his sister, the two of them chasing fireflies in the twilight. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in years, the empty space in Boone Carter's heart felt full. He was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by all he had found. He was finally home.